Getting down to the end here of the semester. Everybody's looking forward to, again, I'm allergic today. It's not COVID. Everybody's looking forward to summer vacation, right? I am. The weather's starting to change, and I'd rather be anywhere other than inside a building, although today it's kind of crappy. It's overcast and windy. And all right, so we need to talk about products and marketing and the ethical issues involved in marketing products. Again, ethicists will say that marketers historically have thought of themselves as providing goods and services that are necessary, and what becomes necessary and what becomes sort of a want can be enormously blurred lines. And so the issue is that in a world in which we have such abundance, maybe we're creating products that are forming irrational wants and desires rather than simply satisfying needs and desires. We're making people want things that maybe they shouldn't. What about products that we do need, though? I mean, there are even issues with those. So for example, in a previous edition of your text, I don't think this is any longer in the current edition. Last time I looked, they focused on issues in pharmaceutical marketing because obviously, and as we've gone through a pandemic, we all recognize that pharmaceuticals are something that are not a want, they're a need. We're going to live in an enormously crowded society in which the spread and transmission of dangerous infectious diseases can be, exponential in a matter of weeks. What is it that constitutes good practices and ethical? How much should they be charged? How much should we charge for prescription drugs? Studies that they used to have in an older version of the textbook was a product that involved the manufacture of a drug called diethylstilbene. That's a mouthful, right? DES. This is not in this version of the textbook, I don't think, is it? Do you remember reading about DES? So I like this case because this is one of these that is actually a really good example of maybe something that we want, although maybe a lot of people feel that they need, and it involves product safety in the pharmaceutical industry. So there are various types of issues that people can have when they try to have a baby. And I know from my own family's experience that this can be a rather traumatic event. My sister-in-law and her husband have tried for a long time to have babies. They now have 2 children, but they've gone through a series of miscarriages in this attempt. She has miscarried, I think, something like 7 or 8 times over the course of the attempts to have children. She now has 2. The most recent baby was born about a week and a half ago, so we have a new family member, and we're very happy about that. But she tried for a long time. DES, or diethylstilbestrol, is a drug that was brought to market for people specifically like my sister-in-law to help them actually carry a pregnancy to term. So there are various issues that you can have when you want to get pregnant if you're not able to conceive. That can be one issue, right? Those people who just they don't produce an ovum that's capable of fertilization. Some women, my sister, for example, she's been a marathon runner all of her life. She's always had about 5% body fat. It's lucky for her that she's never wanted to have children because she just does not cycle regularly. And so she's never really had that issue, and she doesn't want children, but that can be an issue. But there are women who can get pregnant, but something in their system causes shedding of the uterine wall, right? And they just don't have the ability to carry a child to term. And that's one of the things that happened with my sister-in-law. She has this issue where she just has a lot of miscarriages. And so this drug was invented to stop that. Now, this seems like, I mean, for people who want children, I never wanted to have children. My wife, or one of them, said that she never wanted to have children, and she had 4 after we were divorced, so apparently she didn't want to have children with me, which I was reading, by the way. Every once in a while I look at ratemyprofessors.com, and somebody said he's the most arrogant person I've ever met. He said that he divorced his wife because she looked fat. I never said that. Like, it's on video, people. If you're going to quote me, get the quote right? I used a hypothetical in which I said at the beginning of this class, at the beginning of this semester in this class, something like, your insignificant other asks you, how do I look in this dress? And you say you look fat, right? I mean, and then I said, it's the reason that I am divorced, because I never said that. I said, you look like death in pastel. So if you're going to quote, get the quote right? And I never said I divorced her. I've never divorced anybody. I've been the one that's been run off every single time, mostly because I have this tendency to say these really obnoxious things, right? Because I'm just like, whatever pops into my head comes right out my mouth. So anyway, most people want to have children. I never wanted to have children. My sister never wanted to have children, but most people do. So they manufacture this drug which allows you to stop having this problem. Now, years after women who took this drug and carried children to term successfully had children, and those children were raised and grown and maybe having children of their own, a significant portion of the female offspring of these women who took this drug contracted a rare form of cancer. And so they traced this back to taking this drug, that these mothers who took this drug to conceive a child, it now caused cancer in not the male offspring, as I understand it, and I'm not a medical doctor, not the male offspring of these women, but the female offspring of these women years after their birth. This is not like they're born and they have childhood leukemia, or I'm like, they reach maturity. And of course, these people sued the drug manufacturer, claiming you gave me cancer, right? Is that fair?
A lot of commercials, whenever you buy the drug, they always going to slide in all of the side effects.
That's one of the reasons why we now have these commercials that have at the,
cancer.
I mean, if you look at the package insert of the drugs that you take, you wouldn't take them.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, if you read, the guy who does my yards refused to get vaccinated. Like I mean, like, because he read the package insert. Now, mind you, he is a committed 3-pack-a-day smoker, and he reads the package insert for the Pfizer drug, and he finds something in there that may be carcinogenic, and he says, "I'm not taking that. You could get cancer." And like I'm like literally becoming apoplectic here. Like, you're sitting there smoking like a freight train, and you're worried about cancer in the Pfizer drug? Really? He also like goes to the convenience store and buys like 5 Red Bulls a day. The guy lives on cigarettes and Red Bulls. And I mean, like, I'm just, but he's read the insert somewhere of all the things that may happen to you if you, and I don't even know that he did that. He probably got on some, website that says, cause cancer. Well, almost everything can cause, I mean, if you live long enough, you're probably going to get cancer and die, right? What I'm worried about is not dying tomorrow, right? So take this drug, you have a child, and then years later, this child develops cancer as a result of something in this drug. And it only happens to female offspring. And you sue the drug manufacturer. Now, this brings up a lot of issues of fundamental fairness. Who should be responsible if you are injured by a product? Yeah.
I mean, you should know what you're signing up for.
But the argument is that these little girls didn't know what
Yeah.
their mothers took this drug,
Yeah.
right? Their mothers took this drug, and years later, oops, they developed cancer. And I guess some of them died. That's bad. Cancer's bad. Of course, sort of what you're saying when you sue the drug manufacturers, I should never have been born. Right? Which is better? That you are born and you live somewhat of a life and you have cancer, and maybe it's a horrible death. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I don't remember reading what the effects of this cancer are. Most cancers, a lot of them are not really painful until the very end. There are ones that are enormously painful, and there are ones that are not painful until the very end. And then it can be excruciating pain, to the point where they can't give you enough morphine to keep you out of pain. What you're arguing, though, in effect, by suing the drug manufacturer is I should never have been born. Because in the 1970s, when this drug was produced, if you didn't take it and you had this condition, the chances of your getting pregnant and carrying a child to term were very little, right? Is it fair to hold the drug manufacturers liable for these kinds of issues?
I feel like it varies on how much the drug company tested it. Like if they knew that it could cause cancer, then yeah, I feel like it's fair to then sue for lack of basically proper research.
But also if they put the side effects on whatever, like you were saying, the insert, I feel like it is the people's parents agree. Not agree, but
It's in the fine print though, because whenever you read those commercials on TV that says, if you've taken this drug, contact us, the lawyer who can buy it for you. So
Sure.
definitely it's in the fine print, and how the lawyer is able to kind of use their perspective on it to.
Well, the
when it
fine print,
makes sense.
apparently my yard guy is capable of reading the fine print and figuring out what kinds of, I was just sort of amazed because, the guy is, I didn't think he had the mother with to actually read anything much. He's, but apparently we've gotten on a website, and I'm thinking it's probably the latter, that we've gotten on a website, and if it's on the internet, it must be true. No, which my mother used as an example. So we have another employee of our business, one of our housekeepers. She was telling my mother that she'd seen something on the internet on YouTube. And my mom's like, that's just crazy, Amanda. And she's like, well, it's on YouTube. It must be real. And my mother's like, for God's sake, Amanda, Grant has a YouTube channel. As if nothing I could possibly say would be real, right? I'm just out here winging it as I go along in class, every day. I'm just making this stuff up, whole cloth, me and Immanuel Kant are just engaging in thought experiments out here. The fine print, okay, you should read what you're taking before. Yeah.
But at the same time, parents make a lot of decisions for you. Like when you're born, you get all these vaccinations that can also affect you in the long run too. But when you're a minor and your parents are making those decisions for you, it's not something you can go back and argue and sue for.
I guess you can. Cause these women did.
I mean, yeah, I guess you can,
You
but
know?
like, I mean, same thing goes hand in hand with all the decisions your parents make for you before 18.
You all are too young to remember this, but there was a time when I went to college, I am approaching the point in life where I will have been on this planet half a century, and that certainly seems rather old to me now when I think back. But I am, at a point in my life where I can remember back in college when we could smoke in the buildings. When I went to school at OU, started out, you could smoke in the hallways of every buildings, and professors could smoke in the classrooms. And did. And then it got to the point where we could only smoke in the student union, and then we could only smoke in one restaurant in the student union. I was a committed smoker at the time. But, children rode around with most parents now don't, although I still see people that do, but most parents now don't ride around in cars with, their children smoking. There are some that still do. They're trying to pass laws to prohibit you from doing that. I have some neighbors across the street, they're also committed smokers, but they go outside, they have kids. And they go outside and I never see them smoking in the car, but there are people so are you gonna sue your parents? We know that secondhand smoke causes cancer. Should we sue the tobacco? We did actually sue the tobacco companies over secondhand smoke, right? That's part of, in fact, in Oklahoma, we have something called TSET, which is the tobacco settlement money that we got as a result of suing the tobacco manufacturers for all of these things. Yeah.
But isn't TSET kind of not working in a roundabout way?
How is it not working?
Whenever you are given, so you're given nicotine pills and patches and stuff by
Mhm.
TSET, correct? But you have to go through like a lot of red tape just to be able to get to that point. Where
Well, they do, I mean, they do a lot more than that. They do a lot of educational things and one of the things that we know is that smoking is decreasing among everybody except your age group, by the way. Like, I quit smoking, it's been 20 years now? It's been 20 years, a long time. It was the hardest thing I ever did. Maybe led to one of my divorces because, you're just not a pleasant person when you quit smoking. My spouse at the time got on what was called Wellbutrin. That's what they used to prescribe before Chantix for quitting smoking. And I just quit. And I know I was not, I was like, I'm not taking a drug. I'll just quit. It's not a pretty time in my life. But, now I'm much better off, I'm sure. I remember smoking is so addictive. I remember the first time that I walked past somebody with a cigarette and didn't think, that smells good. And it was only about 5 years ago. That was, I remember it clearly. It was 5 years ago and we were walking downtown and somebody lit up a cigarette and I just thought, oh, that is disgusting. But, before that, that's how addictive this is. And you're riding around in a car with your kids. I mean, in my era growing up in the 1980s, that everybody rode around their car with their kids smoking. You could smoke in the grocery store. People smoked in the mall. I look back, one of the things that's happened in recent times is fewer and fewer people are wearing heavy cologne. And the reason is that we don't smoke anymore. And you had to wear all this perfume. Basically, shampoos were heavily perfumed because we had to get the smoke. And even if you didn't smoke, you were subjected to smoke. In the early era of product development, the common law, which originates in Europe, and of course we get, held the doctrine of caveat emptor, which means let the buyer beware. So for most of our history, the common law at Anglo-American jurisprudence was buyer beware. And this worked okay. The idea is that if you were stupid enough to buy something and take it, you should bear the risk of responsibility of the costs. And this worked pretty well for most of our history when products that we manufactured were pretty basic and people could look at them and tell about the quality of the item that they were getting. Again, if you go back even to the beginning of the 20th century, which is not that long ago, I guess it seems like a long time, 122 years ago, the vast majority of Americans lived on a farm or were in rural areas. Cars were just in their infancy. And we didn't have all of these things. So, basic products that people purchased were clothing, implements of husbandry, which may be inherently dangerous, but you could sort of look at them and tell that they're inherently dangerous, right? I mean, if you look at farm machinery, you can look at it and just see that that's going to be a danger. So clothing, food, and sort of implements of husbandry or trades or things like that. It was books, that all seems fairly benign. But as we start manufacturing more and more things and becoming more and more complex, the doctrine at common law changed to one of negligence. So it was no longer that buyer beware. If you went back in time, again, to the beginning of the 20th century, there were all kinds of people who called themselves doctors and traveled around in covered wagons and sold, people could show up in the land run in April 22nd, 1889, and sort of decide they were going to be pharmacists. And there wasn't a whole lot of regulation of that the way there is today. Now, if you want to become a pharmacist, again, when I was growing up, you went to pharmacy school and it was a bachelor's degree. Now, if you want to become a pharmacist, it's a doctoral degree. It's a professional doctorate. It's beyond the bachelor's degree that you have to go to get this degree so that you can push pills. And I don't know why you need to have a doctorate for that, because the vast majority of the time, 99.9% of the time, what are they doing? They're filling a prescription, putting it in a bottle. They're not doing anything. If you went back again to the beginning of the 20th century, pharmacists engaged in a lot more of what we might call compounding, which is manufacturing this stuff and saying, here's the tonic for whatever ails you, your knee, or, and maybe it worked, maybe it didn't. But as we got more and more advanced, we went from caveat emptor to this idea of negligence. Well, negligence is based on this idea of duty, right? So we start saying, with regard to products manufacturers, beginning in the Industrial Revolution, the common law begins to evolve, and we start getting positive law that influences this as well, that says we now are no longer going to let people just manufacture whatever they want and stick it out there. Although a lot of stuff is still, you go into the pharmacy aisles, and I would be willing to bet that a lot of you buy stuff that is really not really regulated. And as long as they put at the bottom this disclaimer in the fine print that says this is not intended to treat, cure, prevent any illness or disease, it's okay. What are things that say this that you buy all the time? Vitamins. Like, look at the supplements that you get. And there's always some new supplement that seems to be launched by people that's supposed to be, extraordinarily helpful. Cindy Crawford is always on when I'm, an insomniac and I'm up late at night. She's always on pushing her, her doctor, whatever his name is, the go-go juice that they have that's supposed to make you look 50 years younger. The secret of Cindy's skincare regimen. And that's kind of sort of in many respects kind of unregulated. But, with regard to most pharmaceuticals, we have this idea that you have to do these tests and you have to go through this. So we have this idea of negligence. Negligence is based on duty. So now all of a sudden you go from owing no duty, buyer beware, to if you're going to manufacture something that may be dangerous, you have a duty to make it reasonably safe for the purpose to which it is intended. Right? And again, this is we get these as a result in an intersection of both the common law and the positive law. So we have various sources of law in the United States. The common law is based on stare decisis, which is judge-made law. And then we have something called positive law, which is statutes that are enacted by the legislatures, the Congress and the legislatures. And we have, 51 of those in the United States. Actually, we have more than that because we have territories that have territorial legislatures. They're not states, but, so we have more. But in theory, we have 51. We also have something called constitutional law, which trumps positive. Which trumps positive law. So this idea of duty starts to form as we become more and more urban, and there's a series of cases called the railroad turntable cases, and this is how the common law has influenced us. At the beginning of the 20th century, railroads were the big dominant companies in this country because they were the ones that were moving goods across the nation so that we could have this industrial revolution, this expansion. And at the time, engines didn't go backward and forward. So how did you, when you got to the end of the line, what'd you do? Did you just dump the engine off and forget about it? No, they had these things called turntables. You can see remnants of these in San Francisco. If you go and ride the trolley cars in San Francisco, they'll jump off. Some of the trolley cars only go one way, some of them go two ways, but they'll jump off. I was there, 10 years ago riding the trolley cars, and they'll jump off at a spot, and the guy who has the conductor of the trolley car has this key, and he'll go out in the middle of the street and turn this thing, and this disc in the middle of the street will flip the trolley car, and it will head it down another track, right? So you got this turntable. You all are probably too young to remember these, but when I was a kid, one of the most popular rides on the playground that, we had at every school in America on usually asphalt was the merry-go-round. Have any of you seen these? They don't put them in playgrounds anymore because they're just, what we would do is we would you'd get like in the center or somewhere, and you'd have one kid that would run and like kids would go flying off the merry-go-round. And and that's what these turntables were like. They're like a merry-go-round, right? And so forever and ever and ever at the common law, the rule was trespassers are owed no duty. And if you went and you trespassed on somebody's property and they set up a bear trap or whatever and it killed you, well, sucks to be you, you're owed no duty. Keep your kids at home. Don't let them wander. Watch what they're doing. Then we start to industrialize. People move to the city. They live in areas where they're close to their jobs. These jobs are usually factory jobs. So people have kids. They're living in these tenements in these factory type cities. And how do these goods get to the rest of the country? Well, they are by railroads. So these factories tend to pop up along railroad lines. And all of a sudden you have this turntable that's used to turn the engine around. And you got a bunch of kids and you got a high density population. And what happens? What do the kids do? This looks like a toy. It's mechanical, and they get on it and they ride it around. And what happens? Well, they start losing body parts on these. And the common law rule was, well, trespassers are owed no duty. And it starts to change. Courts start to say, now you've manufactured this thing that's inherently dangerous. It's attractive to children. And it's easy for you to lock it up. It's easy for you to prevent them from getting on this and playing with it. right? Like they do in San Francisco. You have to have a device to operate this thing. You could put a fence around it, you know. So all of a sudden we start seeing this idea of duty emerging. And that influences, this becomes what's called the attractive nuisance doctrine with regard to products. It starts to influence everything. So now we're no longer just seeing product liability. Then we went from you were only owed a duty to the people who bought your product, right? Or who, you know, might be reasonably foreseen to be hurt by your product. And that all sort of makes sense, doesn't it? To us, like we see this makes sense. Like you got kids, you know there are kids, you've chased the kids off the turntable. You should lock the turntable up. It's a product, it's dangerous, manufactured by the railroads, dangerous, you know. So we start to see the duty extend beyond just the buyers of the product or the users of the product to other people. See, we see this transformation. And the positive law then starts to take effect, and Congress starts enacting things like, you know, the Food and Drug Acts, which say that you can't sell sick chickens. There's a whole series in the common law in law school that I had to read called the sick chicken cases. You know, the marketing. What constitutes, you know, wholesome food? And now we have all kinds of laws that regulate this, down to you know, you can't sell. It used to be people would go to the farmer and buy milk. You can't sell. How many of you watch Schitt's Creek? Anybody like Schitt's Creek? A few of you. Remember the episode where Johnny Rose he gets this milk that's all raw milk. It's not been pasteurized, and he thinks it's the best milk, and then they get caught. You know, his daughter buys all of it because she, you know, he said like maybe, you know, a dozen or something, you know, liters or pints, a dozen pints. And she thinks a pint is like this huge thing. And all of a sudden he's got all this raw milk that he's trying to offload. You know, now it affects all sorts of things. You can't just go to the farm and buy raw milk. Or we can't market raw milk, right? So we have this positive law that starts to take effect that influences all of this. And I think most students understand, like, okay, if you manufacture a drug that's dangerous, you should take the responsibility for it. Or if you manufacture a product like a turntable, you ought to take responsibility for it. So you have duty, and then you have a breach of the duty. So you have a duty to protect children from harmful things that you bring on your property. You breach the duty by not locking it up. It's easy to do. You put up a fence, or you put in a device that locks the turntable so that they can't get on it and play on it. And isn't that nice? Then you have to have injury, and then you have to have cause, right? And then there's what we call cause and fact. And proximate cause, which is legal causation. Cause and fact, you could have an infinite series of regresses if you use a but for. So it's, you know, but for the negligent act of the defendant, plaintiff would not have been injured. But if we use that test, I mean, usually we can tell what causes the injury using a but-for test. But if we use that test, you could have an infinite series to the point where you say, well, but for the fact that plaintiff was born, he wouldn't have been injured, right? And you could blame mama for plaintiff's injury. And we're not going to let you do that, right? It's too attenuated at some point in time. Here's another example. Ford versus Searcy. Willie Searcy is writing in the front of his father's F-150 pickup truck in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, his stepfather's pickup truck. His stepfather tells him to pick up something on the floor that he's thrown down, a piece of trash or something like that. And he's got on a seatbelt, and the seatbelt has two parts of it. When I was a kid growing up, seatbelts were what? Anybody remember these? Anybody see? They look like the seatbelts in airplanes. There was a lap belt, and that was it. Now seatbelts are the lap belt and the shoulder harness, right? The lap belt is generally fairly tight and stationary, but the shoulder harness moves. As young Willie bends over to pick up the piece of garbage on the floorboard of his father's F-150, and the F-150 is what? Anybody know? The most popular selling truck in America for 20 years running, something like that. It's the most popular selling pickup truck in the United States. I think it's 20 years. It's at least been the last 10. I mean, they advertise this every year during truck month. Ford does that, the F-150 is the most popular truck. He's bending over and the shoulder harness is slack because the way they work is there's a tension regulator that engages the shoulder harness at the point at which it feels a sudden amount of tension on that harness to keep you from slamming into the windshield, right? But he's going forward when his father slams into the car in front of them. And because he was applying a constant pressure on the shoulder harness at the point that his father impacts the car in front of him, the tension regulator doesn't catch. And Cersei is slammed into the front window, causing major injuries, including multiple fractures. He ends up being a quadriplegic. And of course, who do they sue? Ford, claiming that the tension regulator, there was a product design defect in the tension regulator, that if you applied sudden pressure to the shoulder harness, it would engage that tension regulator and it would stop you. But if you were applying, this is a design defect, if you're applying a constant pressure already at the time of impact, this is like a freak accident, isn't it? If you're applying, it may not catch and you get slammed. And this is the reason that you have shoulder harnesses, by the way, is because they figured out in crashes that these seat belts that we had in the cars when I was a kid growing up were really good for holding your little body in place. But A, they could cut you in half if the front part of your body was going too fast, accelerating too fast in a car wreck, or they could do serious internal damage to your organs, right? Which is now why we have airbags and all these other things. And so they sue Ford for millions of dollars. Ford, of course, defends under the fact that, like, this is not reasonably foreseeable. Who would think about this? Who would think that the daughters, not the sons, but the daughters of these people who took this drug, like, this is not reasonably foreseeable? This idea of, at some point you have to say, like, this is not, like, I can't predict everything that's gonna happen. This is like the butterfly effect, right? And under a theory of negligence, in fact, most companies would have escaped liability for these kinds of things, because drug manufacturers would have said, I can't predict that only women, children, 20 years after. I mean, the only way you can try that, are gonna get this dreaded cancer, is to try the drug out and wait 20 years. And that's one of the things, again, like my yard guy, and when I'm like, Jonathan, you're sitting there smoking and you're worried about carcinogen. Well, you don't know what the long-term effects of that drug are gonna be. Well, that's true. But, it's amazing to me how many people who won't take the drug then got COVID and wanted to take the experimental treatments that had not gone through full FDA approval so that they could save their life. And we have no idea what the effects of those drugs are gonna be long-term. But, you know, when you're facing meeting Jesus tomorrow, all of a sudden you start believing in medical science. Didn't believe in it before, but we're gonna believe in it now with the experiment. I mean, it's just like, this is magical thinking, right? And the truth is, we don't know. We could develop, 20 years from now, we could develop some strange cancer as a result of having taken the COVID vaccine. And is that reasonably foreseeable? And so the rule became at the common law that you weren't liable for, that we had to say manufacturers, the liability ended somewhere. And we had that with legal causation, which is this idea of proximate cause. This is highlighted by something called the Fallsgraf case, the Fallsgraf versus the railroad case. Mrs. Fallsgraf is standing on a train platform, waiting for a train. When a man is rushing to catch a train, the train is pulling out of the station. He is about to miss the train, so he jumps on the train, at which point a conductor shoves him onto the train, and he drops a package which happens to contain explosives in it. The explosives go off as they go under the train. The reverberation, the shock waves from that, cause some scales on the other end of the platform to fall and hit Mrs. Fallsgraf in the head. And of course, who does she sue? She sues the railroad company, because the conductor, but for the push of the conductor on this guy, she wouldn't have been injured. Right.
You're running with
But you're not, the guy doesn't have any money. So we're gonna look, plaintiffs are gonna look for who has, like the guy with the like I would say sue the guy with the, and you're going to, right? In the modern era, what we're gonna do is we're gonna sue everybody. I'm gonna sue the guy with the explosives, and I'm gonna sue the railroad, right? For this. And the court says that's yes, but for the push, he wouldn't have dropped the explosives, and you wouldn't have been injured. But that's not reasonably foreseeable, is it? Like this is crazy. This is cuckoo time. Well, as products have become more complex, we now have this idea of strict products liability, which this is one of the ones that business students really don't like. So I think we all understand, like maybe a lot of business students, when I talk about this, they like caveat emptor, because it's like, if you take it, you ought to know the risks. And maybe we've gotten really crazy, even with regular products negligence, because we knew what the risks were from smoking for how many years, right? I mean, when we got the tobacco settlement, like that seems like everybody knew. Although, see, the cigarette companies during the 1980s, how many of you have seen a movie called Thank You for Smoking? They actually did this. They actually hired lobby, and they had scientists that would go out and say, there's no real proof that cigarettes cause cancer or lead to heart disease, or they did this. And I think what people thought and what juries thought was, that's a bad actor, right? Like, you knew for a long time that these were products that caused really a lot of damage and were highly addictive. And they're doing it again with the vapes. And the vapes that are, all kinds of flavors that are attractive to children, that will get them addicted to nicotine. And we don't know what the long-term effects of those will be. But we start seeing a development in the law once we start getting really complex products, where we start imposing something called strict products liability. This no longer says that you're negligent. Under the doctrine of strict products liability, if you manufacture a product and somebody's injured by that product, even if they're not the purchaser of the product, even if they're just a consumer or a user, or even maybe a bystander of the product, you're going to be strictly liable for those injuries. Now, this is the one where most of my ethics students become sort of apoplectic, because strictly liable, that's the way we get the products manufacturers to be liable for these women who have cancer. Because if you think about reasonable foreseeable under the negligence test, that's under this legal causation theory, that's not reasonably foreseeable. That's like us taking the COVID shot and let's say only the male offspring of men who took the COVID shot get cancer 30 years down the road. Because it's only it only affects, let's say, prostate cancer. I think we should have a prostate cancer awareness month. Women have, men can get breast cancer, but only men are gonna get prostate cancer. So, and they trace it back. Now you're saying that these people are liable. Doesn't that seem, from an ethical standpoint, fundamentally unfair? You're now holding people accountable for stuff that, like, they didn't, this is crazy. Who would have foreseen that only the female offspring of these women 20 years later or 25 years later would get these kinds of diseases? But you're liable. If you manufacture the drug, if you're Johnson & Johnson and people use baby powder, you're now liable. Even after, people use this for years and years and years under strict products liability. Doesn't that seem to be inherently unfair?
I feel like it can't, going back to the vapes, I know Juul, they recently got hit hard with regulations about their fruity flavors of vapes, because
Sure,
they said it was-
that's obviously
yeah, but you have these other companies that are making the same thing taking their place, so it's at what point are they getting hit harder than these other companies that are just
well,
filling the
and
gap?
what will happen is you'll have a class action lawsuit and they'll lump all of the manufacturers in and they'll say, you're all liable.
Yeah.
And a bunch of those manufacturers will go out of, this happened. A lot of people used to manufacture cigarettes, and then there's only a few companies that now manufacture cigarettes. But you'll have abandonment, and these companies will go broke. Strict products liability, yeah.
In the case of Tide Pods, would you say that the parents would be suing under negligence or strict products liability?
It's strict products liability, right? I mean, because who's ultimately negligent with the parents who have these Tide Pods that are I guess they're dangerous to children, is that right? Like if they eat them, little kids stick everything in their mouth. They eat dirt, they'll eat cat food, it's just if you have a kid, you're just constantly running around trying to ensure that they don't eat something that they shouldn't, which is why we have all of these child-proofing devices for our homes. Isn't it? Shouldn't you keep the Tide Pod locked up? In the olden days, that would have been the defense. Parents, you should watch your kids. And in the modern era, we say you should watch our kids. You agree?
No,
Not
at all.
You don't agree? Why not?
You should definitely watch your kids.
You should definitely watch your kids. Somebody else shouldn't watch your kids.
No.
But people do. Right? We do it all the time. This device has become the #1 babysitting device, I think, in the nation. Give the kid the cell, and they're amazingly fast at very young ages at being able to manipulate the cell phone. When my nephew, he's now got his own cell phone. You know, but when he was 5, he would get my cell phone and all of a sudden there would be like thousands of apps that he downloaded on the cell phone. I'm having to clean up. It's like, God, why is this thing not working? You know, all these apps are constantly running. I had them all open. Now we have this idea of strict products liability, and it's not just the manufacturer, it's anyone in the distribution stream is strictly liable. So anyone from the retailer to the manufacturer, and generally speaking, what's ended up happening is you start suing the manufacturer because that's who has the deep pockets, not the retailer. Although retailers now, you know, who's the wealthiest man in the world today? Is it Elon? I think it is.
He only recently passed Jeff Bezos, right?
Yeah,
So,
but it was Amazon for, you know, I mean, the retailers have a lot of money. For a long period of time, who was the wealthiest man in the world? When I was a kid growing up in Oklahoma, Sam Walton. Where was Sam Walton born? Anybody know? Kingfisher, Oklahoma. His family moved to Arkansas. So now we have this idea of strict products liability. Doesn't it seem inherently unfair? Well, what kind of theory of ethics could we use to justify strict products liability? By the way, in the case of Willie Searcy, Ford appealed and appealed and appealed until somewhere in the chain, Searcy had to have 24-hour-a-day nursing care to keep him alive, to change the ventilators on him to keep him alive. And somewhere in the appeals process, as they're trying to keep this patchwork system of caregivers going, somebody took a phone call and forgot to turn the ventilator back on, and Willie Searcy died. And Ford escaped a huge judgment of liability, thanks to someone who now sits on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals named Priscilla Owen, for giving Ford a huge windfall and sending it back to the trial court and overturning a judgment in favor of the Searcy family. It's one of the things that she was grilled about when she was up for confirmation in the Fifth Circuit. He died. This is a freak accident. Who's in a better position to bear the cost of that accident? Ford, right? Like the Searcy family can't afford, and the person that they ran into obviously is not negligent. The stepfather's negligent. But, you know, if you have basic insurance, how long is that gonna last when you have to have a series of caregivers 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in order to take care of this child? It's not gonna last very long. Who's in a better position? What theory is that justifies that? It's purely utilitarian. Purely utilitarian theory, right? That justifies strict products liability. Who's better positioned to pay? But ultimately, because companies don't really pay, who ends up paying? If we had similar price reductions in the cost of cars as we have seen in the pricing of computers, the average car should run on a thimble of gas, go for 20 years, and cost about $25. I remember the first computer my mother bought for her company. She was one of the first real estate companies to have an IBM PC. And this was back in the 1970s. It cost thousands of dollars. At the time in the 1970s, the average household income was something like $18,000, right? The average car could be bought for something like $5,000 or $6,000. Now, what's the average car cost?
20,000.
Oh, it's more than that.
35.
More than that. It's over 50 now. It's over 50. Yeah. You know, I mean, a Cadillac Escalade's $100,000. You're pushing $100,000. How many of those urban assault vehicles do you see roaming around Edmond, land of the shallow and pretentious? A lot. You know, who's in a better position? And a lot of it is as a result because of cases like Searcy versus Ford. They didn't end up paying on that one, but they ended up paying a lot on things like the Ford Pinto. Although in that case, I would argue they shouldn't have been held liable under strict products. It was negligence. They knew that the gas tank was going to blow up. And they put it out there anyway, because that was just the cheapest way to make the car, and they wanted to get a car that I think the average cost of the Ford Pinto at the time was supposed to be something like $2,000. That's what they wanted. They wanted to get a car that was under $2,000. And so strict products liability says, who's in a better, well, ultimately, who ends up paying for those things? Well, we all do. The price of cars is now, over $50,000. It's why the average age of cars in the United States has gotten more and more and more. It used to be that the average age of the car on the road was something like 5 years. Now it's 10. And it's the reason that you get all of these phone calls constantly telling you that your extended warranty is about to expire. Because people are, I think those are mostly scams, but people are they're having to, keep their cars longer. So they're getting things like Car Shield. Because cars are enormously expensive. So ultimately, we all bear the cost of this, which is purely, again, utilitarian. We all pay a few dollars more for our pickups or our, Cadillac Escalades as a result of this. But the company's in a better place than those people who are hurt by it. Ethics and pricing. We are perhaps there's no such thing as a purely capitalistic system. If we had pure capitalism, I could charge anything I wanted for any product I wanted, whenever I wanted. Which would mean that during times of tornadoes and hurricanes in Florida, because lots of hurricanes spin off tornadoes, right, when they come ashore. If I had sheetrock, or if I had not sheetrock, but plywood, I could charge $80, which, by the way, a sheet of plywood today is about $80 anywhere in the United States currently. But historically, you could get plywood for, $15, $20. But in places like hurricane disaster areas, if you had a purely capitalist system, what could happen? What would the price of a sheet of plywood go to at, every Home Depot in Florida every time the hurricane, National Hurricane Center issues a warning? Well, the price of plywood would go up. You can charge whatever you want, which leads to monopolies, right? And price fixing. So we limit all of these things because we say that they're bad for the consumer. Historically, when my brother was in Stillwater always had higher gas prices than everywhere else in the state of Oklahoma, because all of the gas stations in Stillwater were owned by two people. That's no longer true. They were owned by two people, and miraculously, the prices were always the same. And they had breakfast every Wednesday morning or something like that. They engaged in price. Now, proving it is very difficult. Predatory pricing. We have seen huge problems with this in terms of loans, second mortgages, the subprime mortgage lending crisis, which, we fixed it and then they went back, right? Just as we don't, the only lessons of history, according to the historian William Durant, are that nobody ever learns the lessons of history. We fixed a lot of the subprime mortgage lending issues after the housing bubble during the Bush administration, and we're back at it. It's why the number of foreclosures is going up currently. And I read some article on CNN where some analyst says, we're not going to have another housing bubble. Really? I've also heard that we're never going to have another oil bubble and that we've reached peak oil. This theory, really? Probably not. These are enormously complex issues, and they are context dependent, which is one of the reasons why when we think about the 4 Ps and the integrative nature of product, price, place, and promotion, we are seeing a lot of ethicists and business ethicists argue that businesses need to focus on the triple bottom line, which is people, planet and profits in thinking about these things. Now that's abhorrent to the followers of people like Milton Friedman, who was sort of the father of modern or neo-capitalistic free market thinking, who says that business has only one objective, and that's to make money. Anything else is unethical. But your generation is recognizing more and more and more that there are societal responsibilities to these things that corporations have. And it's one of the reasons why social entrepreneurship has been growing, and places like, or companies like Bombas and Tom's have done better and are popular among particularly your generation. Well, that's all I have. If you feel cheated because I'm letting you out 8 minutes early, you let me know and we'll stay late next time. I'm gonna try and get your essays graded as quickly as I can on the second exam. I know you're anxious about that. I've had other projects that have been coming due, and so I'm a little backlogged, so I'll try and get that done. If you got ducks, come and see me. And I will see you next Tuesday.